In Activity 10, Sink or Float, students observe how different objects behave in water. Students first predict whether various objects will sink or float, and then test their predictions. You will need the following materials from the kit. Activity Sheet 10, buttons, pint-fluted containers, corks, foam pieces, marbles, large paper clips, rough rocks, rubber bands, shells, plastic spoons, sorting trays, small washers, 1 balloon, 3 sticks of clay, and wood samples. You will also need to provide resealable plastic bags, bag of clay, dull knife, scrap paper, paper towels, scissors, and tap water. To prepare for the activity, make a copy of Activity Sheet 10 for each student. Cut the clay into 3 centimeter cubes with the dull knife and cut a piece of scrap paper into 3 centimeter squares. Blow up the balloon with air and fill the fluted 1-pint containers 2/3 full of tap water. Make sure to have paper towels on hand to wipe spills. Each team of 2 will need a fluted container with water and a sorting tray containing the following items: a button, a cube of clay, a cork, a piece of foam, a marble, a large paper clip, a rock, a rubber band, a plastic spoon, a scrap paper square, a shell, a small washer, and a wood sample. To begin the activity, point to the container of water at the front of the classroom. Then, hold up a rock. Ask students what they think will happen to the rock when it is placed in the water. Students will probably understand that the rock will sink to the bottom. Place the rock in the water and make sure all students observe the rock sink. Then, show students a balloon. Again, ask students what they think will happen when the balloon is placed in the water. Place the balloon in the water. A student should observe that the balloon stays on top of the water, or floats. Define the terms sink and float for your students. Inform students that if something sinks, this means it drops to the bottom of a container of water. And if something floats, this means that it rests on top of the water. Explain to the class that whether an object sinks or floats is another property that students will investigate in this activity. Distribute a sorting tray with materials to each team and a copy of Activity Sheet 10 to each student. After students have examined the objects on their tray, ask them to predict which ones will float and which ones will sink. Have students record their predictions in questions 1 and 2 on their activity sheets. Then, distribute a container of water to each team and have students test their objects to see whether they sink or float. Instruct students to draw a picture of each object they test on their activity sheets. The objects that float should be drawn at the water's surface, and the objects that sink should be drawn along the bottom of the container. When teams have finished their investigations, ask students which objects sank, which ones floated. Students should have observed that the button, clay, marble, rock, paper clip, shell, and washer sank, and that the cork, foam, paper, plastic spoon, rubber band, and wood sample floated. Then ask, what makes an object sink? What makes an object float? Students may suggest that heavy objects sink while light objects float. Some students may realize that shape is a factor as well. Finally, guide students to understand that the shape of an object can affect whether an object floats or sinks. To demonstrate, hold up one of the team's cubes of clay. A student should recall that the clay sank. Challenge students to figure out a way to make the clay float. After some time, ask students if any of them were able to successfully make the clay float. If students weren't able to make the clay float, point them in the right direction by asking, what other things do you know that float on water? Or, how do people travel across water? At this point, students should say that boats float on water. This should lead the students to form the clay into a boat shape, which should float. To conclude the activity, pour out all the water and dry all the materials in containers. Place the clay in resealable plastic bags and return all materials to the kit. For science background, reinforcement activities, curriculum connections, and information about the science reader, please consult your DSM Teacher's Guide.